Okay, so class 3, we're going to focus more on equalization, okay? And now we're going to really dig into some of the individual components. Mastering EQs are generally different from kind of many of the EQs that are used standardly in the mixing process, in that the accuracy and the quality of them is critical, right? So when you're working with the mastering EQs, many of them or most of them are very transparent. And the whole idea of them being transparent is that you want to be able to shape or control the frequency response characteristic of a mix without necessarily tonally shaping it. You don't want to color it. Now, many analog EQs and even digital EQs, when you apply equalization, create a phase shift within the band that you're boosting or cutting. And that phase shift, when added in with the rest of the audio that's unprocessed, will actually start to color the sound in a negative way, okay? And particularly for mastering. So mastering EQs are much more surgical, right, or much smoother sounding. So if you have a very particular frequency, small area that's being exaggerated for whatever reason in a mix, you can notch it out, right? So you may apply that type of filtering. You may get in and do more general broad EQ, right? So you want to add in like a broad shelf, right, above a certain frequency, 3 or 4 or 5K, or up above 10K, right? Things like that. The way that the EQ characteristics are shaped, right, will go into that. There's a bunch of different processes that are involved with working with mastering EQs, mastering equalization techniques like feathering, right? So if you're boosting a frequency, generally the additive EQ in the mastering process is limited, right? So in a mix, you may actually add, 6 or 8 dB at a particular frequency if it's really that deficient, but you would never really end up doing that in a mastering, okay? Or if you had to, the mix would have to be really bad. So what that means is that when you do equalization, you can actually increase, right, the sharpness of it, and I'll show you here. If I kind of swing back here for a second. Okay, let me get my my pen here just to add a. So if we're working with an EQ, and let's just say we kind of have a kind of level line here, and so let's say this is our frequency response, the basic frequency response of what's going on, and we do an additive EQ. In other words, if we had like a shelf up at a particular frequency, it may only be like a half dB or a small amount. But we can actually exaggerate the effect of this by doing a slight dip, right, before, right, and a slight boost after, right, that shelf. And what that'll do is it'll kind of sharpen that transition there. And so it'll actually sound like you're getting more high frequency content there than what you normally would. And this is the same that is true, like if you're boosting a particular frequency, you may want to dip a little bit, boost in the frequency area that you want, and dip a little bit on the other side, so that what happens is this is more focused, right? And these are very slight amounts, and it makes this bump here that you were trying to achieve in the mix or create in the mix actually come through, more cleanly, right? More clearly, a more focused way. Okay, so the whole key really for most of this is all about being transparent, so that when you listen to the mix, it fundamentally doesn't change. You're really using the equalization to balance the frequencies. Now, there are a couple things within the frequency characteristic, our frequency response, which is 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz. Okay, and the truth is that no matter how loud you listen, our low frequencies, we have a roll-off, a natural roll-off there. And on the high frequencies, the average male above 40 years old can't hear above 5K, okay? And so it's a type of thing where if you don't use it, then you actually start to lose your ability to hear those particular frequencies. So we have a natural roll-off on the high frequencies. And so applying filters is a powerful way of tightening up the frequency response of everything. Sometimes mixes come in and they have a lot of sub-frequency energy. And one of the problems with that is that when they're played through a system with subwoofers, and if it's a particular mastering, say for a club, you could leave that stuff in because the system would be able to handle it. If it's for an actual commercial release, then all of this sub energy down here makes your speaker driver, the low frequency speaker drivers, work very inefficiently. And as a result, it creates a ripple effect of distortion across the other frequencies that are above it. Okay? And so quite often the best thing to do here is to filter off these sub-frequencies so that the frequencies that the speakers can handle, they're done more accurately, right? That's a real key. And there's a similar thing on the high frequency with the high frequency drivers. And because, really most people, even if you brought them into a quiet room, couldn't hear above 16 or 17K anyway, just from environmental noise, right? And just the general noise that people actually go through on a day-to-day basis living. You don't really need those frequencies. They add some detail to things, but they have a tendency to roll off very quickly in people. And so the younger you are, the more you have them. Or if you listen to detail in a lot of music, you can preserve and even increase your frequency response in those areas to some degree by how well you take care of yourself. And just the fact that when you use your hearing in a very detailed listening kind of way, you will improve its ability to discern the differences in things, right? You'll be able to hear more accurately and be able to hear more subtlety, more detail. And part of that is increasing your frequency response, right? So applying of filters here is really key. Like you even saw here on this particular mix that I was doing here where I had an EQ plugin, and you could see here that I had like a cut on the low end and a cut on the high end, right? And there's a little boost there on the bottom of it, right? So it kind of takes away the inefficient area of the low frequency and high frequency drivers, but gives a little bump there, right? And this particularly worked for this given mix, right? No other EQs placed in anywhere along the way, right? Simple thing, right? So the application of filters is a very powerful way of bringing out, right, some of the quality, right, so that you get accuracy in terms of the overall frequency response and everything else, right? So we really don't get into additive EQ as much, okay? Or when we do, it's shaped, right? So it's not heavy kind of additive EQ, right? There's what they call like a Hippocratic oath, right? And it's basically do no harm, right? So when you're working with audio and you're mastering audio, really you're not trying to destruct something. Well, you do that later, with the maximizing process, right? But generally, not so much, right? And where the EQ fits into the processing chain is depending upon what else you're doing, right? So if those of you guys who have followed me in the mixing workshop, I take on a certain process where I filter first, compress, and then work with equalization shaping afterwards. Actually, even in between there sometimes is some effects processing. And the signal chain for mastering can be very similar. You filter first, right? And then you start to work on the different compression techniques that may help to bring out more of the presence that you're missing that you may be trying to get with an EQ. And then as you start to work through that, you may apply some very subtle forms of early reflections or reverbs in there, right? Or kind of work with some sonic or some, work with some technology to kind of I'm sorry, I keep wanting to say maximizer, but that's not like an oral exciter type of effect, right? Where we're trying to bring in some presence that way. And so we could start to work that way before we get to equalization. And sometimes you can actually take on those characteristics a lot better, right? Or more easily, right? And then you find that if you do equalization afterwards, you're doing far less of it. And it's only shaping up everything else that you've done in the process, right? So there's a very similar chain of processors that happen, right, and the way that those things are done. And so as we go through each of the individual ones, you'll see where the EQ fits into the processing chain.